Welcome everyone. Happy Friday. My name is Josh Campbell. I'm the CEO of Techonomy. Excited to continue our conversation around topics related to the intersection of technology and healthcare. We partnered today with our longtime friends and agency W2O Group to facilitate this conversation. So in a second, I'll hand it over to Aaron to start that off. Additionally, this is really for us the ability to start talking about our initiative that starts next week called the Health and Wealth of America. It's a series that we'll be launching in partnership with our sister brand Worth Magazine and Worth Media. We have 3 days of programming planned for next week. We do start off with Dr. Zeke Emanuel, so excited with that. We have a great lineup, as you can see some of the names here. Steve Case, the founder of AOL, now launching Revolution. People like Kathy Besant, the COO and CTO of Bank of America. Ken Washington, the CTO of Ford, as well as people like Anthony Scaramucci and the former Secretary of the Treasury, Larry Summers. So hopefully many of you will join us as part of that initiative next week, and we'll see you there. As I mentioned, we do have a poll up, so please take a second, fill that out, and we'll be looking at those results over the next 45 minutes. If you do have a question, if you have a comment and you want to sort of join the conversation, please use the chat feature. I'll be looking at the chat and making sure we try to pull in some of the voices throughout the next 45 minutes. So at this point, want to hand it over to a longtime friend and CMO of W2O Group, Aaron Strout, to facilitate the conversation.
Well, thank you, Josh, and I'm thrilled to be here and just scrolling through the polling data. I do want to introduce, first of all, the session and then my two esteemed panelists who look lovely this morning. And if you couldn't tell, I was dancing a little bit during the music because I do love me some 80s music. You're here to talk a little bit about something that's near and dear to W2O's heart, which is making the world a healthier place through digital health. And you're going to get two great perspectives from leaders in their respective industries or companies. And really the goal today is to dive a little bit deeper into digital health and how the role of technology is impacting healthcare for the better. So I will start by introducing Melissa Oprasuth. She's the COO at Pareto. I love the name. Actually, I love both of the names. I'm a big fan of the Pareto principle, which I believe had a role in the company's naming. And just to give a quick top line, and Melissa will talk more about this, but it connects patients from community health centers who serve disproportionately minority and underserved patients to relevant clinical trials nearby. And then we have Jennifer Leventure, and Jennifer is the VP of Business Development at MedRhythms, also a very cool name because you'll find out more how it ties into what they do. They are a digital therapeutics company that use sensors, music, and software to build evidence-based neurologic interventions to measure and improve walking. Critically important for people with Parkinson, people that are recovering from strokes, and we're going to dive more into that. So first of all, welcome Melissa, welcome Jennifer. Happy Friday to you both.
Delighted to be here.
Likewise, very happy to be here. Thanks.
Well, and thank you for sharing your Friday. And then thank you for everyone in the audience, and a special shout out to Esther Dyson, who I'm a big fan of, who showed up today. She is a legend in the industry. Before we jump in and get started, because I'm going to ask both of you to give a little bit of a thesis, and we will be fielding questions toward the end. So if you want to start threading those through, you're welcome to do that in the chat. Interesting responses to a few of the questions we popped up, and this will set the stage for some of the conversation we have today. Do you engage in some form of digital health? So seven people, so 58% said yes. 33% said no, 1% said I'm not sure. So if you were not sure, we're going to tell you more about whether you are or aren't right now today during this. Which of the areas of digital health do you think will provide the most benefits? Remote patient monitoring seems to be leading the way. A little smaller in the digital therapeutics. Jennifer may convince you otherwise today. Use of real world data, which is critically important, especially to things like clinical trials. So Melissa, I'm sure you'll have an opinion on that. And a little surprised by the AI, although I think a lot of us are sort of over the AI piece, right? Because we got told that it was the second coming for such a long time and hasn't really delivered probably to the degree we would like. And then this is a really interesting one. And we talked about this in our conversation, our prep conversation the other day. And that was, where can digital health really make the greatest impact on underserved communities, telemedicine in particular? So rural was the one that really comes to mind, 58%. And I do agree that a lot of people do get impacted in rural areas. It is a bit of a conundrum, which we will talk more about as well, because those are some of the areas that aren't always as well served. And then lastly, this is, I guess, not shocking. Has your physician ever talked to you about participating in a clinical trial? I think there's still sort of a mystery around what a clinical trial is and how it works. And, Melissa, maybe we can get into that as we dig in. So one of the things that I have asked both of our phenomenal guests to do today is I like to really sort of talk a little bit about their thesis on the topic, right? So if we're talking about making the world a healthier place through digital health, let's start, Melissa, with you and sort of your take on that and what Pareto does in that regard. I know I gave a little bit of a tease, but maybe we could dive in a little bit more deeply there.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Delighted to be here and speak with both of you guys today. So I thought maybe it would be helpful to give just a little bit of background on kind of the origin story of Pareto, and then fast forward to today and what we're focused on in the context of digital health. So we were founded in 2012 by a team of physicians who had a track record in successful startups. Sermo is the company that they had previously started. Many of you might be familiar with. And in 2012, the focus was matching the right patient to the right resource at the right time, sort of the Pareto principle of matching supply and demand. And the way that we did that was building a referral management technology. And we quickly became the largest referral management technology in the States, with large academic medical centers, many of the large hospital organizations you might be familiar with, like Dignity Health, Mount Sinai. But fast forward to the more recent state, in addition to referral management, we have this suite of products that are focused in a very different patient population and healthcare organization than we had previously been involved in. And as a product of academic medical centers myself, I had never heard of this. This acronym is called an FQHC, or Federally Qualified Health Center. And the reason this is important, I think, I'll bring it back to today in just a moment, but this type of an organization focuses primarily on an underserved patient population, minority patients that are typically access challenged and disproportionately disease burdened. And I think in terms of access, we realized there was absolutely no access to clinical research. If you look at clinical research participation, it requires a lot of serendipity. So we realized that we could apply our experience in technology to make sure that patients that were seen in these health centers, which, by the way, there are 2,000 of them in the United States that see hundreds of millions of patients a year, making sure that all those patients had the same access to clinical research and innovative therapies that patients that are seen in academic medical centers have. And so I think, we can talk about COVID, but I think it's never been more clear that certain patients are completely left out of clinical research. And so that's the problem that we are trying to solve, is health equity in access to innovative therapies.
Awesome. Well, thank you for kicking us off with that. Jennifer, we'll give you a chance to give your thesis and talk a little bit more about MedRhythms, and obviously we'll dig into some of the cool and awesome work that you all are doing to combine music with helping patients recover, and particularly their walking, which is such a critical role in everything that we do.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think even just starting generally, I think one of the sort of key thesis around digital health is really starting to see true scale in that across a number of areas and technologies and different applications within sort of the broad field of digital health. And I think that that's also true, thinking more narrowly in the more defined space of digital therapeutics as well, which is where we at MedRhythms focus. And just to give a bit of background on sort of our founding and story as well, co-founder and CEO of MedRhythms, Brian Harris, actually was instrumental in establishing one of the first neurologic music therapy programs in the country at Spaulding Rehab Hospital in Boston, which is a top rehab hospital in the country. And, was seeing great results in delivering these relatively newly developed interventions in neurologic music therapy and helping patients through their rehabilitation journey. and was having very, very difficult conversations with them as they were being discharged from inpatient rehab, in that there was no way to continue to access this therapy outside of the hospital because there are so few clinicians trained in these interventions. And around the same time, we're really starting to see a lot of movement from FDA and other regulatory bodies in terms of establishing and clarifying pathways for software as medical device, which really was then the genesis of our digital therapeutics platform, where we're, if you will, leveraging software to replicate the clinician's brain and then deliver these neurologic music therapy interventions to help with rehabilitation in stroke, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, a range of other neurologic and neurodegenerative conditions.
I did the cardinal sin of putting myself on mute and then talking. I try not to ever do that, and I always encourage my guests not to do that. So thank you, Jennifer. One of the things that I do want to start off with, because Esther Dyson did ask us a good clarifying point about the poll, which we were talking about, which area of digital health do you think will provide the most benefit in the next 12 months? And she wisely said, what kind of benefits and to whom? So I think we did leave that somewhat broad-based. It does look like remote patient monitoring is one of them, and that is something that we did talk about yesterday. But let's talk a little bit about that. And so if we are looking at remote patient monitoring, helping patients over the next 12 months, which types of patients do we think? I mean, I think, in the case of Med Rhythms, Jennifer, that's a little bit tricky, right? Because you need that hands-on to really help with the digital therapeutics. And then Melissa, we'll touch on that with you in just a sec.
Yeah, I mean, I actually would say that, from our perspective, we actually see a fairly substantial a potential for remote patient monitoring to help both clinicians and patients. If you think about gait as a key marker for a number of things, including disease progression, it's highly correlated to fall risk. So from a remote patient monitoring perspective, as we think about our digital therapeutics platform, using sensors as a key input, I actually see a fair amount of potential to leverage that for remote monitoring, and also then into the future looking at things such as digital biomarkers as well to help with understanding of various attributes of disease progression or rehabilitation. So I mean, from that perspective, I think definitely see potential clearly to patients, but also to clinicians, and then that I think translates through as well to payers and health plans in terms of having a better understanding of how at a population level or even at an individual level there is that step of progression and an additional element of understanding of disease and health.
Okay, well, thank you. And so Melissa, I want to spin that over to you. And as someone that works at a company that really helps people connect, particularly where it comes to clinical trials, this has been an area that has been really harmed by COVID, right? It helped and harmed. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But it is difficult to, to connect with people and to walk them through all the different processes. And, how have you helped some of your end clients do a better job in this time where we are more remote than we've ever been and really need sort of that help to connect the dots?
Yeah, great question. So I think it's fair to say that meaningful change in healthcare doesn't happen unless it really has to. And I think remote monitoring is a really good example of kind of the state of the state, given the pandemic and the need to have patients out of the healthcare setting. We have a variety of clients that are finally actually using the technology and getting reimbursed for it, which is just an awesome thing. As far as remote monitoring goes, for patients that present with COVID symptoms, go home, have remote monitoring so they can, check their pulse ox, things like that, as well as in clinical research. There is finally, precedent for actually distributed trials. There's a lot more coming out around distributed trials, the ability to effectively gather the patient data outside of the clinical setting. I think we were a little bit behind in the past couple of years in clinical research, and I think the next year or so, there's certainly a lot of eyes and incentives aligned, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, that is a silver lining, right, that comes with all of this. One of the things I think it might be helpful for, because we did have one of our audience members that said that they weren't 100% sure where they sat in the digital health space. Mm-hmm. maybe we could talk a little bit about what digital health means. And I think this will be a little bit of that proverbial, it's the six blind people in a room. I won't say men because that we can up level that. But, depending on where you stand and where you touch the elephant, you touch a tusk or the leg or the tail. I think a lot of people have different definitions of digital health. Maybe it would be helpful for us to take a step back and say, what do we define as digital health? Because I think there's sort of this broader umbrella that it feels like it's health innovation. So things like clinics that Walgreens and Walmart are bringing to us might fit in that, even if they're not necessarily focused on the digital piece. And we have the digital therapeutics piece, which I would argue, Jennifer, dives way into like what digital health means. But Melissa, let's start with you. How do you define digital health? What does that mean to you and to Pareto?
Yeah, I think about it pretty broadly. I think about it as technology that sort of enables providers and patients to improve their care. And it can be in a variety of settings. It can be in a patient's own hand. It could be organizations like Direct Primary Care that use a suite of technologies to improve their patients' care. It's hard to view something, I suppose, maybe a piece of paper and the paper charts as an example of something that's not digital health, but I think it's really hard to experience healthcare without some element of digital health today.
Thank you. Jennifer, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, we're seeing really significant advances in the landscape. And I think as the number of applications in digital health proliferate, it's been really helpful, I think, in clarifying sort of, if you will, swim lanes within what was really before this very nebulous concept of what is digital health. So I think now you're starting to see a number of, if you will, industries within digital health and applications within that I think it helps to start to clarify some of that nomenclature and remove some of the nebulous, hard to digest what that really means. And I think we're seeing that in terms of, proliferation of health and wellness applications, telemedicine, remote patient monitoring, digital therapeutics, digital medicine. And I think that, we could probably spend, hours on any one of those given topics. But I do think that, as this is broadly advancing, starting to see some real definition around what that means and some clarification within those aspects.
Well, thank you both for sharing those thoughts. One of the things, Jennifer, that you just mentioned during our prep the other day, you mentioned a critical ruling by the FDA. And this is one of the things that we're seeing is as regulations are changing and evolving, right? We lived in a bit of an archaic time. And I would say that the Affordable Health Care, one of the things that did is getting a mandate for all records to be electronic healthcare records. And that gives us better access to information sharing, data mining, from obviously a safe and sort of anonymous kind of way. But one of the things you mentioned is in 2017, the FDA made a ruling that allowed for digital therapeutics to be considered sort of in the same family as med device, right? So you had software that was kind of treated as its own separate entity, and now it's something that actually can help. And I have a feeling that's really helped us fast forward significantly. So can you talk a little bit about the impact of that, maybe on the broader industry, and then how that's helped MedRhythms in particular? Yeah,
certainly. And I mean, I think, not to put all of it in 2016, 2017 timeframe. I mean, there were first iterations, even as far back of the 1990s, of FDA having some concept of software in medical devices or as part of medical devices. But really, thinking around that 2016, 2017 timeframe is when guidance was really starting to be clarified around the fact that there could be clinical evidence in support of a software-based medical device, and really, help to clarify this concept that software as a standalone service could be a medical device that has some therapeutic impact. I think which, is really, a great point in terms of developing, a regulatory framework for this. And, in some ways, FDA led some of the other, countries globally in terms of clarifying a regulatory pathway for that. As Melissa said, things often in healthcare are slow moving and, require, substantial change in order to precipitate, movement away from status quo. And I think that, the one piece now is we have regulatory pathway, but what about reimbursement and adoption? And I think now we're starting to see, and partially spurred by COVID, but I think even looking beyond the pandemic, now we're starting to see where there's wider adoption, acceptance, and reimbursement and recognition of the value that digital health can deliver, and are now, in addition to changes through the FDA, are starting to see things from CMS, Center for Medicare Medicaid Services regarding continued and further expanded reimbursement of telemedicine, remote patient monitoring, even digital therapeutics, breakthrough devices. So I think that this is very helpful. It's a very good tailwind for the industry as a whole. And then, to the point around MedRhythms, I mean, certainly, we recognize value in having clarified regulatory pathways, and now further, pathways towards having, as we will have prescription digital therapeutic products, having a pathway for reimbursement by third-party payers of those as well.
That's a good point. And I do want to talk more about the role that sort of the third-party payers play, because it's such a critical piece to the digital health ecosystem. But Melissa, any additional thoughts in terms of how evolution in sort of regulatory rulings, FDA, have impacted your business? I'm sure it's been fairly profound as well.
Yeah, I think in our entire suite of products, I think we keep a close pulse on all the regulatory movements happening. I think just in terms of the past year, I think looking at how trials are conducted and where they can be conducted at home, the definitions for what's an investigator, it's finally a little more patient-centric. I think there's still a lot more room for improvement, but it's definitely going in the right direction. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that is a good segue into the question I want to ask is, we've talked about the impact that the pandemic has had on us, and then we had the George Floyd incident, which really sparked this awareness around what was already a fairly important, big, game-changing movement in Black Lives Matter. One of the biggest issues that I think has come to light because of COVID, and now, because we're really exploring what this crisis that is racism is having as a healthcare impact, is that there are these horrific healthcare inequities, right? There was an article in the New York Times the other day that talked about the fact that in some of these COVID trials, that only 3% of the population that's in them are Black people. And given the fact that they are being disproportionately impacted, it's a double, I think one of you mentioned, maybe it was Jennifer, a double tragedy, right? So, it's such an issue that this is happening. And where I want to go with this is, what impact is this having on your businesses? And, Melissa, it's probably a little bit more straightforward with you, but Jennifer would love to hear your take too. So Melissa, I'll start with you on that one.
Yeah, I'd actually be really interested to hear Jennifer's perspective on this as well. I think in healthcare, the way patients are treated and what they're introduced to, whether it's clinical research as a care option or potentially a digital therapeutic, there's so much serendipity that's required for a patient to happen to see a provider that, just using clinical research as an example. A patient has to happen to see a provider who is an investigator at an investigator site, sees the patient, identifies that the patient could be appropriate for clinical research. It's just a ridiculous amount of serendipity that's required, and it's frankly not fair. And so one of the things we talk about a lot is, how do we make sure that the providers that are seeing, minority patients have the tools and sort of the, I think, education and attention to make that health equity more a part of the conversation. So I think in particular with COVID and this social justice crisis, I think it's fair to call it, we talk about that a lot, making sure that, I think provider education with particularly minority patients in clinical research, we have a really bad history in America of abuse, and there's a lot of distrust. So we really focus on that provider education piece to make sure that the patients are introduced in a trustful manner.
Yeah, that's such a critically important piece, because, it is one of those things where we've had horrific experiments, and I hate to say them, but where, people, particularly people of color, Black people, have been inhumanely treated and tested. And that on top of the fact that, our current situation where there is so much injustice across a lot of different fronts, in particular in healthcare and in health inequities. You can certainly see why. And that was one of the things that this New York Times article went on to look at, was how do you build that trust? How do you work with community leaders to bring people along to say, look, it's important that we do this because we need to protect ourselves, right? And if we don't, then we're going to get a vaccine or a treatment that's provided to us that actually wasn't built for us. And that's really scary and can be harmful. So with that, Jennifer, I am also interested in hearing how this has impacted med rhythms and, what you all do. And so, share your point of view on that front.
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, one of the things that, we think a lot about is, as we approach design, how do we incorporate the voice of the patient? And, to that end, establish patient advisory boards and, making sure that we have a diverse range of opinion or perspective that actually helps inform our product development, such that, the product is really designed to meet the needs of the population of patients who will be using the product and interacting with it and engaging with it on a perhaps day-to-day basis. And I think beyond that, thinking about inequities in healthcare, as we think more about our approach to commercialization, are also trying to be creative in ways that we can enable access to the product, and ensure that there's equal access and awareness of therapeutic options that may be available. And sort of beyond that, one other component that we are also cognizant of is, because we use music as part of our mechanism of action, understanding the role that music has in people's day-to-day lives and understanding how we can thus optimize and personalize a patient's treatment journey and regimen through use of music, and understanding that that may look very different within different socioeconomic, ethnic, geographic, even within disease states. I mean, if you think about our range of applications or indications, there's a very different sort of patient persona in a stroke survivor than in, say, perhaps an MS indication. So we're, trying to be very cognizant of that, and also thinking about how we can then personalize and bring that music into the intervention to help further improve outcomes and access.
Well, I have to ask you a question. And I've watched some of the videos on your site that show people listening to the music and how it's improved and some of the metrics. How do you pick the music? I mean, and do you look at things like Mozart versus Rage Against the Machine? Or, obviously there are some that I'm sure are much better suited, but you did touch on something interesting, which is, I'm sure there's a science behind which music actually works better on reprogramming the brain. But there has to be, from a age, from a background, from a whatever, you're sort of turned on by or inspired by. Like, does that play a role in how you use music to help some of these patients?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, there's been some early clinical studies that have actually shown improved outcomes when user preferred music is delivered. And so, as we think about how we then translate that into our therapeutic and our product, we've actually built a screening platform that allows us to screen any piece of music for its therapeutic value and its therapeutic potential. To that end, there are certain types of music or elements of certain songs that make them not great candidates to be therapeutically activated, but we have the ability to screen really any piece of music, assess its suitability, and then we can augment, amplify, modify the music as necessary to then respond in real time to someone's gait and drive towards their clinical outcome or that clinical response. So yeah, I mean, definitely, as we think about this, or thinking about how we can really deliver user preferred music to optimize the patient experience, their engagement with the product, and ultimately then hopefully drive further improved outcomes.
Well, thank you for that detailed answer, and thank you for endeavoring, my Rage Against the Machine versus Mozart piece. I guess, Melissa, I'd like to ask you a little bit is, you obviously deal with a lot of different patient populations that you're moving into clinical trials, some young, some old, different ethnicities are more impacted than others. How do you use technology and some of that specificity in terms of I mean, not everyone reacts the same way, right? You just talked about the trust piece, and how do you bring some of these folks along? And is there an element of technology and some of what you've learned over the years that does help you sort of better fill certain trials versus others?
Yeah, there's been actually some really interesting research in this about how to reach a diverse patient population. And I think for us, we've used, having, I think, relevant types of language and the way patients understand clinical research and are educated around it. That's sort of table stakes. We really focus on what does the provider interaction look like with those patients, and how do we enable the provider interaction? There are lots of companies that address direct to patient kind of communication, and we realize that there's a ceiling to that. It requires patients to already sort of be interested in clinical research. But where we're looking to expand the top of the funnel, we're really focused on the trust that the patient and provider have to be able to understand kind of what are my options, what are the considerations that I should have as a patient. And so we focus on technology that is not intrusive to the provider's workflow, but yet they think about a patient going to, introduced to a clinical trial as easy as sending a referral, for instance. So we're really focused on our technology enabling that conversation with the patient and provider.
Well, thank you for that. And it is probably worth noting that your founder, if I'm remembering this correctly, did create Sermo, right? And for anyone that's on the call, I'm sure you probably heard it, but this is one of the first forays into creating a forum where people could talk about this and doctors could talk about this. So really having those deep insights into the patient, having deep insights into how, doctors and healthcare professionals think about these things is so critically important. I do want to shift, and I would encourage people to start asking some questions in the chat, because I do want to make sure that we're addressing what you care about. And I think Josh already sort of teed something up. So I appreciate that. We'll get to that in a minute. I do want to find out what other companies in the digital health or the digital therapeutics space you admire. And Josh, you're welcome to stay on and answer the question too if you want to, because I know you deal with a lot of very cool, innovative companies. But Jennifer, I'll start with you. You mentioned some really good ones the other day. I think Pear was one of them. Achille was another one. Palo Alto, Zelt. So not to steal all your thunder, I've just named names, but you can share a little bit about why it is that some of these companies are interesting to you, and if there are any others that you'd like to mention.
Yeah, certainly. And I'd say my perspective here is probably more framed around digital therapeutics, specifically, given that's the swim lane we're in. Yeah, but I mean, I think what's those companies that I had mentioned, I think what's most interesting and compelling there is one, both early leaders in terms of FDA and commercial success, in terms of bringing digital therapeutics to market, and then also starting to work through the hurdles in the process of commercialization and starting to do so successfully. And also, particularly in cases of Palo Alto and Achille, really taking innovative mechanism of action in terms of their approach to how they, leverage a digital technology to treat and manage diseases and conditions. And, I think then, more looking towards, Zelt is, there's always this question of, okay, there's great, we have these digital therapeutics, but how do they fit into clinical workflow? I think it's easier for some to understand how they're part of a patient's journey and a patient's treatment regimen, but there's sort of this question of how does this all fit into clinical workflow? How do we have a prescribing workflow for them? How do we understand what data may be coming back, whether that's traditional remote monitoring or other data as it relates to outcomes or engagement with a digital therapeutic? And I think what Zelt is doing is really interesting in terms of creating that path for integration of digital therapeutics into clinical workflow, which I think will be a key component of whether or not we're able to succeed as an industry.
Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing those examples. And then, Melissa, I know you were thinking of some, and you also wanted to speak to the fact that we've had a clunky system, like we talked about the electronic health records, but there have been a lot of things that have gotten in the way of us doing a good job. So share your thoughts.
I'm excited about a couple different categories of things. I think first and foremost, I still have hope for direct primary care. Like IORA or ChenMed. I think it's fair to say that in the past 6 months, we've uncovered or highlighted, I suppose, the failings of a fee-for-service system. And I think looking at these direct primary care groups is a really interesting way to view how we can integrate digital health, because they have these capitated risk-based contracts. They're able to try out different things like direct mail prescriptions, transportation coverage, remote monitoring, telehealth. And I think I hope that we can see how this works, where the incentives are really aligned to adopt new technologies in these types of patient populations. And then as a pharmacist, I'm also I'm a little bit partial. I think that some of the direct-to-consumer digital mail ordering companies, I think, are just really interesting, long overdue, and just very helpful, particularly for rural patients. I think it's just an awesome opportunity now that the regulatory burdens are gone. Yeah.
Agreed. And I did love, there are two fun facts in your background. I didn't go too deep into your histories, but the fact that you are a pharmacist, and then Jennifer, if I remember correctly, you studied Chinese or Mandarin back in college. So I always love these little sort of tidbits about people. We also found out that Jennifer is sitting in an island in the bay of Casco Harbor, I think is the body of water up in Portland, Maine. So getting a little bit of humanity to what each of us are and what we do. Josh, you were going to ask a question, and since you're the one that runs the show here and people know you, I'd love to take you away from your bartending job for a few minutes and have you ask your question to our two esteemed guests here.
Yeah, so I think the word I heard, Melissa, was trust. And a big part of clinical trials are consumers or patients, or however you want to refer to them, trusting and participating in the process. Obviously, during this time with Project Warp Speed, and even as part of the vice presidential sort of debate the other day, the word trust came up of people willing to participate both in the trial for a vaccine, as well as once a vaccine is approved, would you trust to take it? And I think Kamala said, obviously if healthcare professionals say I should trust to take it, I will. If Donald Trump says I should trust to take it, I won't. Will this have an adverse effect moving forward more broadly, not just on the clinical trial research as it pertains to this vaccine, but trust in trials? If we believe that the FDA and pharma companies are pushing things through at a speed that's not safe, will this have a ripple effect long term?
I think my answer is I hope not, but I think that there's just more to it than that. I think there's certainly going to be distrust, I think, in the vaccine coming out. But having been in conversations with, chief medical officers of these giant pharmaceutical companies, there's the integrity of the data and how patients are handled is like front and center. And it's, and I wish that was communicated a little bit more effectively with patients. It's going to be a very interesting next couple of months. And I think we should trust the process. America has a history of not such a good track record in clinical research. And I think we've got a lot of systems in place in so many ways to make sure that the data is good and that patients are being handled in the correct way. And I think we should trust that process. I think it all comes down to the provider in my mind. Like if you look at health grades, on average, patients vote their provider at a 4.5 rating. Patients trust their providers. And I think focusing on provider education of patients about what that process looks like, looking at the evidence, I think will be just very, very critical to regain the trust that's been lost over the past few months.
Great. And then the other question I had, because it came up in a community gathering that we hosted a couple weeks ago, was there's all this money obviously spent on failed trials that don't get to phase 1 or phase 2, right? So we start collecting data. Ultimately, these companies, no matter what they are, spend millions or billions on this and have to walk away from that. So there's all this orphan data that should be put to work. And if companies came together actually to share insights, although they're very proprietary around those data sets that they've created, do you see a model where some of this historical data that has been collected can actually be put to use to really serve, the population versus just thinking about the commercial sort of interest of each individual company?
Such a great question. I know people are working on this in pieces with registries and whatnot. I think it's a really big opportunity, particularly now looking at, I think, the fact that patients have been disproportionately represented in research. There's a really great opportunity to make sure that, once the drugs are even available on the market, making sure that we understand how they work in a variety of patient populations. I've heard about some kind of federated models with sharing de-identified data. And I think that I haven't heard of any solutions at scale, but I know that there are quite a few people working on this, particularly at the provider level, where they want to use evidence-based medicine for their own patients. So there's, organizations that are gathering just starting it on the ground rather than depending on pharma companies sharing their data.
Jennifer, do you want to add to that?
I think, one piece to, and I agree. I think it's Melissa said, there's a lot of potential there. Likewise, I'm aware of, some people or some organizations that are starting to try to, find paths forward to do that. But do think there's, significant potential in, for digital health to help with, that demonstration of real world efficacy in broad patient populations. And, I think sort of to add on to what Melissa said is, I think that that's one piece where, we now with technology will be much more able to do that than we've ever been able to do in the past. So I think there's a lot of potential in that realm and area.
So I guess in that case, this has really been a catalyst, that this COVID time period has been a catalyst to try things. Aaron, I think we talked about, the amount of people who had never used telemedicine before the pandemic, both on the patient side as well as on the provider side. We've talked to physicians that never did it before, and they had this first experience with a patient who had never had telemedicine experience. And it's amazing because in some ways, a lot of these digital trends that we've talked about for the past decade are now actually being sort of embraced because they have to be. Which is great.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, Josh, it's interesting because, I did my session at back when we could meet in person at Half Moon Bay last year with Livongo and with Houston Methodist, and we did talk about some of these things. And it is interesting just to think of how far we've come. I mean, we all live on this Zoom box now, right? And one of the things I know Michelle Stanbury, who's the VP of Innovation at Houston Methodist, talked about was voice technology. And that was one of the things that we asked about up front. And, obviously, Jennifer, what you have not only goes from voice, it goes all the way into music and coaching people through, but I think it is a way to use these things like Alexa and Siri and, Google Assistant to fast forward some of these things and probably to build trust, to actually build some of these connective bridges between the groups. And, it is interesting that no one will ever sit back and say this pandemic was good, but you're right, it has developed a tremendous amount of comfort with some of these new technologies. It's developed an understanding of why we have to do it. I mean, even clinical trials, right? It's not been safe to go into some of the centers. And so we've had to find ways around, and they say that necessity is the mother of invention. And I'd say that, if ever there was a time that was true, now is that time. I do want to touch on something because we brought this up the other day when we were prepping. And Josh, I'd actually love your opinion on this too, even though I know you're not supposed to be co-opted into being a panelist. But we talked about that the telemedicine, the telepart is critical in doing a lot of what we're doing in a digital health space. One of the things that's hard, and we asked that question up front about, who's being impacted, but whether it's, you're older, you're Black, or in an underserved community, you're rural, so you just don't have broadband. How do we solve this problem, right? Because it's a great solution. I know part of it is bringing clinics and things like Walmart and Walgreens and CVS closer to people, but it does feel like there will still be people that aren't that close to anything that can help them. So, what do we do to overcome this and, to get people better access to telemedicine? Jennifer, I'll start with you since you happen to be the one on my bottom left, and so I'm going to ask you that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as we see it, you know, even the Digital Therapeutics Alliance, I know, has been very focused on, understanding inequities in rural healthcare. And, I think that we all see potential for digital health and digital therapeutics to help address some of those disparities in health and mortality. But again, the question becomes, access, in that, in some ways we've solved for, we've made the product that can go into the home, but still requires that level of connectivity. Speaking personally from a MedRhythm's perspective, we're thinking about how we can enable our devices to function even in areas with low connectivity, to help address some of that concern and still find a way to afford that equal access. But beyond that, I do think that this is a key reason why widespread broadband, potential for sort of the Internet of Things to come through, I think will be very critical in helping to address some of these disparities in health and health outcomes.
Yeah, Josh, as a guy that's, sort of our resident tech expert, what do you think? Like, what are the carriers or some of the infrastructure people doing to help on this front?
Yeah, and I think when you look at sort of, I guess broadly what's called the digital divide, right? The people who have connectivity and the people who don't, or at least access, it's really important to look at not just healthcare, but education, to look at sort of opportunity as it pertains to jobs and skills, right? So I think, again, if we want to talk about what COVID has done as a catalyst, right, employers have had to go into markets and help subsidize connectivity. We work with brands that have people who work all over the world that they had to send hotspots to and provide connectivity at home. I think you see, as far as it pertains to education, right, our students, our kids are home, that connectivity, becomes so much more important. So I guess you could hope that because we're all in this new sort of normal where we need connectivity, not just for telemedicine and telehealth, but for education, for our jobs. You see companies like T-Mobile launched a fund to underwrite, I think, $10 million in connectivity. You'll start to see, obviously, I think, and I hope, Verizon following suit, Sprint, saying, okay, we've priced connectivity so high and made it inaccessible, but now, is connectivity a human right? Do we need to start to go into these communities? So I think you're starting to see some of the initiatives. I think the great thing is connectivity is required across all of these different functions right now. And hopefully we'll start to see subsidies. One of our partners, Ericsson, is working with UNICEF to look globally at how do we bring connectivity. So I think we'll start to see it. I think consumers will demand it. And if the government has to come in and play a role in that, we'll see if that happens as well.
Well, it's funny. I had it mentioned in my notes that this is part of Maslow's new hierarchy of needs, right? It's access to broadband. And I said this at South by Southwest, I think probably 5 or 6 years ago, and it's amazing how actually true it is for all those reasons you just mentioned. Melissa, I don't know if you wanted to answer that, and if not, I do have one final question that I think we can wrap up on. I know our audience is a little shy today. It's Friday morning, and in some places probably still not as caffeinated as they'd like to be. But anything to add to that, or?
I mean, I think just the fact that we're talking about this, I think, is really interesting. Just looking at kind of the purview of clinical research, to even participate in these vaccine trials, you have to have access to internet to provide your outcomes. And just the fact that this is actually coming to light in the conversation, I think, is just important for inclusion for all Americans.
Awesome, thank you. And Esther Dyson is just chiming in saying, just ironic that we talk of remote patient monitoring, clearly a non-patient centric point of view, right? Which, thank you. And I think there are some of us that need to even get rid of the word patient and talk about them as, our customers and people that we're working to make healthier. The final question that I do want to wrap up on, and we'll hopefully give everyone a couple minutes back in their day. I always like to end a little early versus a little late. And that is that you can look into your crystal ball over the next 3 to 5 years. And I know this was a surprise question, so I'll give you a little bit of leeway. Maybe I'll start with Josh, since I know he thinks about these things in his sleep. But what does the landscape of digital health look like over the next 3 to 5 years? And what impact do technologies like AI and having better access to real world data and having telemedicine, really become a true thing as we see like the Livongos and the Teledocs roll up and really create substantive players in the space. So Josh, look into your crystal ball. Where do you see, from maybe more of a tech angle, digital health going in the next 3 to 5 years?
Look, I think, the crystal ball and what we talk about is how do we leverage data to prevent, right, people from getting sick. And I think as we look at these large data sets, number one, it's how do we actually not hold these data sets in a vacuum and start to understand trends across, various data sets. So I think if we could apply AI to start having more of these preventative measures and proactive messaging so that we can understand, I think that's obviously the holy grail. And again, it's something that everyone's been talking about, and I hope that this time really allows people to sit back and start to think about how do we bring companies together, data together, to do a better job of preventative and predictive care. So I would say in a couple years from now, hopefully that's enabled. To your point, Aaron, when you start to look at Google and Amazon and their initiatives, I don't know if I predict that those companies will become more healthcare companies than we know about today. I don't know if consumers want to trust those companies with their data, as it pertains to healthcare. But I definitely think in 3 years from now, I wouldn't be surprised if these big, brands are playing a more sort of integral role in sort of the health space.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I did a podcast, I think it was last week, with Hemant Taneja, and he's a General Catalyst. He's one of the co-founders of Livongo, speaking of them. And he did talk about this in his book that he just released, which I think is called Unhealthcare. And it really does focus on getting people healthy. Like that's the solution. And that actually will take, billions, if not trillions of dollars out of the cost of healthcare versus, treating and focusing on treating. That won't go away, but it is something I know Dr. Eric Topol has also talked about, right? Getting people out of hospitals other than emergency care and really allowing them to be in the comfort of their homes using telemedicine. Melissa, you look into your crystal ball. What do you see?
I think it might take a little more than 3 years, but I found this book really, really interesting by Dr. Raza about prevention and cancer care. And I think just looking at our incentives and how they're changing, and we're much more, I think, focused on understanding what's the true burden of disease. I think I'm very hopeful that we start to align incentives with prevention as opposed to treatment.
Yeah, amen to that. And then Jennifer, last but not least.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and it's already, emerging, but I think it'll be a continuation of the trend of patient ownership or individual ownership of one's health. And to the comment around sort of not having a patient-centric view of remote monitoring, in some ways, I think the discussion today, we didn't focus on that, but I do think that the potential and the impact there shouldn't be overlooked in terms of having data around one's individual health at their fingertips and having an ability to have more ownership and more influence in healthcare journey. And I think, starting to see potential for that and much more sort of adoption and engagement and ownership over the next 3 to 5 years.
I love those answers. Thank you so much for sharing those. And with that, I will start to wrap up before I hand over to Josh, who may have some parting notes. And so this is Aaron Strout. I'm the CMO of W2O. We're a healthcare-focused agency that does marketing communications and other stuff for the healthcare industry. We've had the pleasure of talking to Melissa Oprasuth, who is the COO of Pareto, and Jennifer Lovenshore, who is the VP of Biz Dev at MedRhythms. Josh Campbell, who's the CEO of Techonomy and the founding father of, along with David Kirkpatrick, of all this amazing content. Thank you to the guests for doing this today, and hopefully you have a little bit better sense of how digital health, and in particular, these two technologies are really making the world a healthier place. So with that, Josh, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Well, thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Melissa. Thanks, Jennifer, for joining us today. This content will be made available early next week, so definitely we'll be sharing it with the attendees here. Hopefully, please share it with your colleagues, because I do think that this is an important conversation. As I mentioned, we'll launch our Health and Wealth of America I'm actually getting a Slack that I'm going to put it in the chat, healthandwealthofamerica.com. And our initiative and our event next week will start with Dr. Zeke Emanuel at 2 p.m. Eastern time on Tuesday. So hopefully you'll join us for that. And thanks again and have a great weekend.
Thank you all.
So much.
Yeah.
Good to speak with you. Bye-bye.